We're going to jump into the Bible now and try to figure out more about God and ourselves this week. And I just want to give you a brief recap of what we talked about last week during the Easter service. And essentially, we're going through this letter called 1 Corinthians. It was one of the books in the New Testament of the Bible. It was originally a letter that was written by Paul, and a leader in the early church movement, one of the initial followers of Jesus. And he's taking this message of Jesus throughout various places in the Roman Empire. And one of those places was Corinth. He spent a couple of years there, starting a church in that town, and then moved on to go elsewhere. And over the time that's passed, maybe 2 or 3 years since he was there with them, they've had a lot of questions, and they've been trying to navigate a lot of cultural issues because their culture is pushing them toward seeking honor and seeking themselves. And Jesus' example is pushing them away from that. And so they're being tugged in 2 different directions, and maybe you feel that way in life as well. And so Paul's writing this letter to address some of the questions and concerns that they've had. But where we picked up last week, we were talking about this conversation where some of these followers of Jesus in ancient Corinth, they don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus or that anyone will be raised from the dead bodily. They hold to Greek ideas and Roman ideas that the body, it has a lot of desires and needs and limitations, and all those things are basically bad inherently. It hinders their true spirituality. And so they can't wait for the day when through death they will be able to shed their bodies and move on into some other more spiritual plane of existence. Some of them think that they'll go to the underworld. Some of them think that they'll actually be transformed into stars, and that the stars that they see in the heavens are actually their ancestors who have been transformed into that before them. Others believe that they'll return as spirits to guard their ancestors or as ghosts that will wander the world. There's a lot of different ideas, but they certainly don't think that their body coming back to life is a part of it. They can't even imagine how resurrection would be possible, let alone why it would be important. And so Paul's been pushing back on that, saying there actually is a lot of reason, especially with the Christian point of view and Christian perspective, as to why resurrection would be important. And last week we talked about what would happen without the resurrection being a reality. And Paul said without that, your whole faith is actually a fraud, because you believe that Jesus was God's plan to rescue humanity and restore creation. And if he's just another person that lived and died, all of that is wrong. Humanity's guilt before God is still there because Christ's sacrifice on the cross was meaningless. And so people are still separated from God. And all these people who have died following Jesus before you have actually just been lost to death or whatever form of existence, is out there, possibly in the Roman mind as well. Baptisms, which most of these Corinthians have gone through baptism, it's really just kind of a scam, because baptism is a picture of not only death, but being raised back to life through faith in Christ. And so what does that mean if there is no resurrection? Like, it's a complete scam. And the Christians who deny themselves in order to benefit other people instead of just living for themselves, they're some of the most pathetic people on earth. Because really they should be living to preserve their life as long as possible and to get the most pleasure out of their life that's possible, because after that their bodies are just going to die. So eat, drink, for tomorrow we die should be their phrase and their motto and their philosophy if there's no resurrection. But then Paul counters and he says, but Christ has been raised from the dead. He says, I have seen the risen Christ, but there's 500 people, many of whom are still alive, who have witnessed this resurrected Jesus in bodily form on the earth after his resurrection. And so he's saying this is a reality. And because it's a reality, you do have a reason to follow Jesus, and you do have a reason to elevate other people and not just yourselves. But on the tail end of that reality comes some big questions. And Paul anticipates some questions that the Corinthians might have about what resurrection is like. And maybe that's a question that you have as well. You've heard about this, or even as a follower of Jesus, you kind of embrace this idea of, yes, we'll be raised to life someday. But as far as what that's going to be like, it's just one huge question mark. And so Paul asks 2 specific questions next in our letter that we're going to discuss today about that, to help us wrap our minds around at least a little piece of what it might be like living with a restored, resurrected body. Here's a couple of basic questions that he asks to help improve their understanding. Verse 35 and verse 36. So we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 if you want to follow along. I have the verses here on the screen, but if you like to read along in your phones or Bibles, please feel free to do that as well. But it says, but someone will ask, and so here's some hypothetical questions Paul says you might have, they might have about the resurrection. First question, how are the dead raised? How exactly is this going to happen? Then question number 2, what kind of body will they have when they come? And then he says, you who lack understanding. A lot of our English translations are much less flattering. They say, you fool. But that's not really the aim behind this word. There's another word that means fool or foolish in ancient Greek, and this is one that means just somebody who lacks understanding, which is where a lot of us fit in when it comes to things like what would somebody who was raised from the dead, what would that be like, right? And so Paul's going to jump into those 2 questions one at a time, and we're going to do that as well. And as we get into it, a couple of things. First of all, there's a term that we're going to come up against really fast in these verses, and it's not a term that we use a lot in our current society today. The word is sow, and sow used to be a word that was used, it's a farming term, but it's a way of planting seeds. Specifically, you have this bag that you carry around or you attach to an animal, and you scatter seeds out of this sack of grain all around the field, and then you take a plow and you go over the field to cover up the seeds that you've scattered with dirt. And then plants grow as a result of it. And so Paul's going to use that term a lot, and that's what it means. Essentially the same thing as planting, but it's a specific way of farming in the ancient world. Another thing we're going to get onto with this question, there's something that we need to know a little bit as far as background. So when Paul is saying, how are the dead raised? He says in this next verse, what you sow, what you scatter, the seed you scatter, he's going to use a metaphor between seeds to try to encourage people to imagine resurrection in light of seeds and that metaphor. He says, what you sow doesn't come to life unless it dies. And as for what you sow, you're not sowing the body that will be, but only a seed, perhaps of wheat or another grain. And so he's just recounting this. And this is something that they know. They know that when they scatter seeds, the thing that grows is different than the seed that's planted. But it seems like they might possibly have an idea culturally that the body that's planted in the ground is kind of the body that comes back up. Almost like a decayed corpse rises back up. When I was in college, I worked at a haunted house just for kicks around the Halloween season for a couple of years. And so there were times when I would dress up like a zombie, basically, and wield a chainsaw and chase people around to scare them. I've kind of given that up in my older years, but that was what I used to do in my early 20s. And it was interesting, but that's not what we should be imagining with resurrection. But that's possibly what the Corinthians were imagining. I mean, you believe in some resurrection, so this half-decayed corpse is going to come back to life and be roaming around the earth and, that kind of thing. And Paul's saying, that's not what I have in mind at all. Because like a seed, the body that's planted, when it comes back, it's something that is altogether different form-wise. So human bodies, they're kind of like seeds in certain respects. Human bodies at death, they stop growing, right? And they appear to die. And seeds, there comes a point where a seed it's growing and it's produced. Perhaps it's in the center of a flower. And then there comes a point in time where the flower wilts and it dies, and the seed, it turns brown and hard, and it seems like life is gone from that as well. It appears to die. And then you cover it with dirt, like a body is buried. And then there's this point where something awakens it, right? And life begins to come forth from it, but it's a different type of life than what went in the ground. It resumes life, but it's in a new form. And so that's kind of how we should imagine this resurrection process. He goes on in the next phrase, he says, but God gives it a body as he wants. And he's talking about the resurrection and also with seeds. And to each of the seeds, its own body. And so with seeds, there's different things that activate it. Moisture is a part of it, temperature is a part of it, oxygen and light, and sometimes even decay, because the seed casing has to decay for the embryo that's inside of it to get the water, the moisture, the heat, and begin to germinate. But God, so that's how seeds grow. But it says God gives it, this body that's planted, that's died, a body as he wants. And so God is the agent, or the one who, through his power, transforms a body that's died into the body that will be. And he does it by his power and according to his design. God's the one that gives it. God's the one that does it according to what he wants. And so God is the designer of this. And so that's where the illustration kind of diverges from a seed, because genetically what the seed's going to be, it's pre-programmed. But in the resurrection with our bodies, God sort of has this ability to add some variety, perhaps, to each body in a different way. But it is something that arises from what was planted initially. It's not a different body, but it's something that's very transformed, a very different form, and it's something that is done by God's power in that sense. Thought I'd throw this question out to you. How much faith does it take to believe in the resurrection? What do you think? Does it feel like it takes a lot? I mean, in one sense, some people are saying no, and some people are saying yes. I guess in the sense of like, do you see people resurrected all the time? I've never seen one. So in that sense, maybe it takes a lot. In another sense, if you're going to believe other things in the Bible as true, maybe not. Think about the way that creation was formed, that the universe was formed in the Bible's initial account. You have essentially God's energy and God's spoken word, and that's the catalyst for animal life and plant life coming into existence. And then you read this little summary of humanity in Genesis chapter 2, and it talks about how God took the dust of the ground and formed a human and breathed his life into that human, and the human became a living being, right? That takes a lot of faith, honestly. I mean, my kids love to play in the sand and the dirt, and they've made lots of creatures and critters out of dirt, but they've never created life from that. And so really, I would say it takes about the same amount of faith to believe that life came into existence in the first place. And yet we see life obviously did come into existence, and with incredible detail and incredible design. And so if you believe the Bible's account of that, it's just as easy to believe in the resurrection as it is to believe in the creation. So just an interesting, I think, perspective. So the first question was, how are the dead raised? And I think Paul's summary would be, well, it's by God's power. And it's this transformation process, kind of like a seed transforming into a different form out of that thing that appeared to be dead that was planted in the ground. But the second question Paul's posed is, what kind of body will they have? So this kind of piques our curiosity and our interest, because we wonder, well, what will that be like? And so Paul's going to give us two other things to imagine to help us answer those questions. First, he taught us to imagine seeds, and now he's going to ask us to imagine splendor. Think about some of the most magnificent things that you can imagine, and there's a parallel between that and what this resurrected body will be like. He says this, he says, not all flesh is the same flesh. There is one flesh for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. Now, he doesn't go into detail and explain this in great detail, but I'll tell you what I think he's doing here with that caveat. Here's what I think Paul's trying to communicate, and you can make your own decision on this because he's not incredibly clear. But he says there are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. So there's this difference, between heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but at the same time, there's a familiarity factor. And then he goes on in verse 42, he says, so it is with the resurrection of the dead. And he's going to say a couple of different things that are in pairs. The first pair is sown in corruption, raised in incorruption. And I've kind of paired these things because verses 39 through 41, they give some examples. And then verse 42, it kind of makes the point. And so I'm going to pair the point with the example that I think Paul's giving to help us make better sense of that. And so just like different creatures have different types of bodies, different types of flesh, I think Paul's saying in the resurrection, each body, it's going to have specialized tissues that are suited for specific environments. And I don't know exactly what that's going to be like. But when God created creatures and humanity, he made each one suitable for the environment that it was going to exist in, right? It has a little different texture, a little different feel, a little different biology and setup and respiration and all that, but everything is suited for the environment that it's created for. And I think Paul is saying in the same way, we're going to have physical bodies, tissues, but they're going to be suited for whatever this environment, this long-term environment is like. But they'll be made of substances that will never decay, which is why Paul says sown in corruption, raised in incorruption, the inability to decay. And so it's not like we'll be able to necessarily put our hand through your body, spiritual body. It'll have substance, but that substance won't be prone to decay in the way that ours is today. So God's intention, if we look at the beginning at creation, was always to make this environment where God and humanity could live together. And they were going to work together to cultivate life throughout the earth. People were going to get to know God personally and exist with God. The bodies of animals and birds and other creatures, they were made, and in Genesis 1 it says they were good when they were created. And then the bodies of humans were made, and God said humanity was very good. And they're images even of God, of the divine. And so this resurrection, we shouldn't think of it as God's attempt to replace bad bodies. When God made everything that exists, it was very good. Like the form that it has is very good. It's very fitting for its environment. It's not like our bodies are bad things and there's going to be this more spiritual form of existence that comes about, like the Greek and Romans imagined. But instead, God's going to renovate bodies that are already very good, but they've been impacted by some very bad decisions that we've made and that all of humanity has made to enable these bodies to live forever in an even more improved form. And so that's more of what's happening here. Secondly, there's another thing that's pretty splendorous that the Greek and Romans would have stared at every night, and perhaps you do as well, and that's the stars, the sun, the moon, the heavenly bodies that are out there that exist. They're pretty magnificent, pretty splendorous. And as I was mentioning, in Greek and Roman culture, there was this tendency for them to believe, according to their mythology, that people's souls were transformed into stars or planets after they died. Not only that, they thought that the substance of planets and stars was superior to the substance of our human bodies. Like, if you went out and you could touch a star from their point of view, whatever was making up that star would be a much more durable kind of thing than what our bodies are made of. With chemistry and physics, we know that that's not necessarily the case. Like, right, they're made of atoms just like we are, of different elements. But from the Greek and Roman perspective, whatever that was that enabled stars to exist for centuries and millennia, that must be much superior to our substance. And so they had this view of the planets and the stars, that they were above us and that they were to be honored, not only because their substance was better, but because they might be some of your ancestors looking down on you, right? And so they treated the stars with honor. And so Paul is talking about that metaphor here. He says the splendor of the heavenly bodies is different from that of the earthly ones. By heavenly bodies, he's talking about the stars, planets, sun, moon, things like that. There's a splendor of the sun, another of the moon, and another of the stars. And he says, in fact, one star differs from another star in splendor. So there's not just similarity, there's variety, right? There's diversity if you look up in the heavens at the things that exist there. And he says, so it is with the resurrection of the dead. So there's going to be this superiority in quality, this amazing splendor, but at the same time, there's also going to be a difference of person to person in the resurrection. And then he has this other phrase in verse 43, sown in dishonor, raised in glory. And so he's saying what exists now, our bodies, they're prone to be dishonored. And there are some things about getting old and aging that are very dishonorable. It feels that way to us. And maybe you feel those effects even now with what you're dealing with, or you have people in your family, people that you care about, who are experiencing those things. But he's saying when this body is raised, it's going to be raised in glory. It's going to be raised in brilliance. And so in essence, in the resurrection, each body will be honored. And they're not now, right? Many of us are not honored. Many people throughout history have been dishonored. But each body will be honored for its unique and surpassing brilliance and beauty. So whatever that is, and verse 38 earlier has said that God gives the body, God determines what that body looks like. So whatever each resurrected body looks like, it's going to be unique from others, just like the stars of the heavens are unique. And it's going to be this surpassing quality of brilliance and more beautiful. I mean, maybe some of you have a corner on beauty as this world would determine it, right? Or you did at one point in time. But that's nothing compared to the beauty and the brilliance that this resurrected body will hold. It's going to be a whole different quality, a whole different category. And so those bodies will be honored instead of ignored and devalued and used and mistreated. And there's going to be one more thing that we come to in a moment that's going to explain why those bodies will be honored so much. And that has to do with the change of kind of character, of nature. We'll get that to that in one moment. The last thing Paul says is sown in weakness and raised in power. So in the resurrection, each body will possess strength and health and added capabilities which God alone determines, because he's the one that designs that. It's almost like spiritual gifts. We talked about spiritual gifts several weeks ago as we were working through this letter of 1 Corinthians. And with spiritual gifts, it says that the Holy Spirit gifts each individual as he determines. And he does that for the benefit of everyone. And I think maybe the resurrection will happen in a much similar way. God will design each person's resurrected body for the benefit of everyone, right, in unique ways. And he will determine that, much as the Spirit determines how we're gifted here in this life in different ways. But that word power, it just causes our imaginations to wonder, because power is, that same word is connected with miracles that Jesus performs, with supernatural things, or with abilities or capabilities. And so we don't really know completely what that's like. Next week, we'll take a look at Jesus' resurrected body. That's where Paul goes next in this letter. He points them to Jesus and to considering Jesus' body after it was raised from the dead. And so we'll look at what his body was like. And that'll give us a little bit more maybe insight, or answer a few more questions that we might have, give us a few more thoughts as to what this experience might be like for us. But there is an aspect that's doing away with the weakness and replacing it with power. And we don't know exactly what that will look like. Here's another question. What about disabilities? What about scars? What about tattoos that we have? Will those things continue into the resurrection with us? That's something that I think I'd like to pick up next week when we look at Jesus, because maybe the answer is not quite as clear and straightforward as you might have thought. But that's something to ponder and to wonder about as well. The final thing that we're going to talk about is spirituality, which is something that as people, we are very natural creatures and not necessarily spiritually inclined now, but that's a big difference, a big change that's going to happen with the resurrection. What kind of bodies will they have? Paul would say, well, imagine spirituality. I don't know what you picture when you think about spirituality, but here's how Paul would describe it. He says it's sown a natural body. So when the body dies, it enters the ground as something that's natural. What does Paul mean by natural? Because in our culture today, natural is really good, right? Like natural means you get stuff that doesn't have any pesticides, or maybe you take good care of your health, or you're using these ancient treatments for your health, or you're eating really good quality food and meats and things of that nature. So natural is viewed in a good sense. But Paul's presenting it here in a different light. What he means by natural is that the body that dies, the natural body, the ones that we inhabit as well as the Corinthians, right? That body is one that's led by logic and senses. Most of the decisions that you make as a human are because of things that you're thinking and things that you're feeling or sensing. Like those inputs influence the majority of our decisions. Maybe as Christians, we'd like to say, well, I think God influences most of my decisions. I would maybe beg to differ, especially when you think about the types of decisions that you're making throughout the day. You know, do you really consult God on every single thing you do? Probably not. And God created us that way to be decision makers and to take that input of logic and the input from our senses and to make decisions. The only problem is we don't navigate that super well as humans all the time, right? We're led by logic and our senses, and we also have this inclination, this tendency to pursue ourselves and honoring ourselves instead of other people. And by nature, we kind of end up being divisive at times or being responsible for causing conflicts. Maybe through mistreatment, through misunderstanding, poor word choices, accidentally, but this just seems to be where we land at a lot. Our natural tendencies are things that hold us back. So this body that's planted in the ground after it dies has a lot of these types of natural tendencies. But Paul says next, it's raised a spiritual body. So this is a contrast. And Paul has talked about what he means by spiritual versus natural throughout 1 Corinthians chapters 2 and 3 and 10 and 1. All those chapters give us different aspects of what Paul thinks of with spirituality. And kind of when you put that puzzle together, you come up with something like this. The body that's raised, it's led by God's Spirit and by God's wisdom. So that's what Paul means by spiritual. It's making decisions based on God's Spirit, that input, and God's wisdom. And we can begin to step into that now as followers of Jesus. It's just not necessarily that thing that naturally drives us, right? It's not our first inclination. But the body that's raised, its first inclination is going to be to pursue love and humility by default. We're kind of selfish creatures by default. We have to work really hard to be loving sometimes. But in the resurrection, you would be loving by default and humble by default, which would seriously impact all of our relationships, right? And so things like, instead of devaluing people in the resurrection, honoring them and honoring their uniqueness, that would be something that comes instinctually in the resurrection. And the desire would be automatically to nurture unity and to nurture peace. So that's the difference in this body. Paul says if there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. So he's saying the one that's natural is planted, the one that's spiritually minded, is the one that's raised. Then he says, so it's written, the first human Adam became a living being. So he's going back in the Bible here with some very early history. He says the first human, according to the Bible's text, Adam, was given life and reason, right? He became a living being. This kind of natural person, and not all bad in a sense, because his body was very good. Like he was created a very good human, right? But he was driven by reason and logic and his senses, but he kind of got led astray by that. And then there's a contrast. Opposite of that first human and the way things panned out, he says the last Adam, he's comparing Jesus to another Adam that would arise and would change the course of humanity, change the direction of human tendency from the way that Adam kind of guided things initially to a whole different trajectory. He says the last Adam, Jesus, became a life-giving spirit. So he wasn't just a living being, he was a life giver. He says, however, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. So our natural selves, the ones we struggle with all the times, the ones that cause tension in our Christian faith, that's what we deal with first. But in the resurrection, the spiritual side will come fully, and that will be our tendency. So the last Adam, Jesus, was led by God's Spirit and became the life giver. And that's our destiny, to be led by God's Spirit and to just instinctually be giving life to everyone around us. And so, as followers of Jesus, we have received God's Spirit, right? And he's begun to change our hearts and to teach us to operate as a spiritual person. We're entering into this mode of existence, but we're still in this natural body that's led by logic and led by our senses. And so that explains the constant tension that we deal with. In another letter to the Roman Christians, Paul said, the things I want to do, I don't do, right? I want to do these good things, and I don't do those. And the things that I don't want to do, that's what I find myself doing. And so he's talking about that tension that he exists in. And so through God's Spirit, placed inside of believers, God begins to change our hearts, but it's not something that we'll experience in fullness until the natural body is replaced with the spiritual body, with the resurrected body that's to come. So that's where we're left at here. But these same questions, I think, often stir and pique our curiosity, perhaps. How are the dead raised? Right? What kind of body will they have? And Paul gives us a few insights here through what he said to the Corinthians. Hopefully you've maybe gained a few thoughts or ideas today as a result of what we talked about. And I think Paul would encourage us, just like he does the ancient Corinthians, to use our imaginations, because he gave them things, again, to imagine. Imagine seeds, right? Imagine splendor, imagine spirituality. And take some of the things that you imagine, and maybe the resurrection is kind of like that. in different ways, right? That's a start. But another side of it is that your imagination is not enough. It's not enough to picture everything. There's another scripture that Paul quoted. It was in Isaiah originally in the Old Testament of the Bible, but Paul referenced it earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And I think it's a truth that also applies to this topic of resurrection. But what he said earlier was this scripture in Isaiah where Isaiah writes, "What no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no human heart has conceived, God has prepared these things for those who love him." And so I think Paul would say, here's a start, but the shelf drops off really fast. And so just realize that your eye can't see, your ear can't hear, right? Your heart can't even imagine the things that God has planned for those who love him. And so there is this aspect of what lies ahead in resurrection that's even beyond your wildest imagination.